Hello and welcome to the Chess Castle Game of the Week. We have a game here played by Ryan Shiroma against Albert Yang. The game starts with e4, e5, knight of 3, knight c6, very typical bishop c4 Italian, bishop c5, mirroring. Now c3 is the main move, threatening d4, knight f6, and the old line is usually d4 and sacking a pawn in some lines and fighting for the center, but nowadays the main move is d3, just defending the pawn and continuing solid development. d6, h3, slow move, but one of the best, stopping bishop g4s and even knight g4s possibly. Castles, bishop g5, and here black plays bishop e6. Now,
So in this case, it's a little bit better to play h6. This is just like how typically people go about it because you get to kick the bishop out, right? And you gain a spot for this knight to come around in the future, maybe. Right, so that's how it might go. So continuing, white played knight b to d2.
yeah, so in this case, trading this bishop here will only allow black to open up his rook and defend some of the weaknesses that he has in the center. So this only helps white. So knight bd2, just developing, ignoring any of the confrontation. Bishop b6, b4. Now here the computer recommends a move here, knight to h2, going for knight to g4 to double up black's pawns. So for example, after a random move like a6, knight to g4, there's no way to defend this knight, and after bishop takes, h takes, white has the bishop pair and an open h file for the attack, and white's much better. So black would have had to kick the bishop away. Okay.
Yeah, but instead of that, d4 was played, which is the first real mistake of the game. Since it seems black wasn't fully ready here, and because, like, look at this is pinned.
Yeah, the defender of the center is pinned, and after a simple move, actually, bishop takes. Now if you take with the queen, your center is undefended, and you're just going to be losing a piece. So he has to take with a pawn. So that was a slight mistake, and now the pawn structure is ruined.
So we get a little exchange here, and it seems that this king has lost some of his shade. So the way that knight e4 is good at great defense, this pawn pretty easily jumps in, but right, and so the queen came back around, and the threat here is that f5 is going to be played, right? So that's why g4, right? Like, let's say here I'm just gonna play a random move. Let's say f5 was played. Knight goes here, queen just attacks it. Nowhere really good for this knight to go. It's just gonna get kicked around. So that's why g4 is really good, because it stops this idea. And it feels weird because the king is in the center, but so far, as long as it's closed, everything should be fine.
Okay, and there's also another move. My first thought here was maybe something like queen to d2, going for queen to h6, but again, after the threat of f5, the queen is actually covering the square, and the knights aren't going to be attacking very well. There's not going to be any threats, and after a queen to g5, there's queen to g6, and black's perfectly fine. Okay, so g4 is a very good move, stopping the threat of f5. Knight to e7, black is trying to reroute the knight maybe to the center and to f4, put pressure on these weaknesses. So white here decides to try to break through to get to the king using this pawn move g5, and black decides to play f5. So this is actually a fine move, but in my first intuition was that this pawn just needs to go because it's controlling way too many squares. So I thought that after f takes g5, black should still be fine, and the computer gives a line after knight takes queen to g6, which looks scary because after rook to g1, and there's a lot of threats with knight f3 getting pinned. But after king to h8, black is perfectly fine. yeah, sidestepping the pin, and there's no way for white to continue the attack very easily. So this would have also been a possibility. Okay,
But instead
f5.
of 5 was pushed, and now knight f6 is, right, it looks nice, controlling a lot of squares around here. So the king went to h8, and reasonably so, this rook is trying to find a way to get in, just trying to bring more pieces in. And here the best move would have been just to bring a few more pieces in for black before starting this e4 idea. Although it's understandable the king is in the center.
Yeah, so let me go back to this. So the best way for black to play would have been to play knight to g6. So white actually, if you notice, there's no threats for white. There's no way to break through and get in right now. But after knight to g6, going for knight to f4, now you're starting to see a lot of weaknesses on white side, and of course the rook's coming in as well. One line here is after knight to h4, which gives up the knight but wants to get queen to h5. But after knight f4, the queen h5 doesn't work anymore because the knight's covering the square. And black has moves like rook a d8, attacking very strongly. And then if white tries to castle queenside, c5, moves like c5 will simply break through the pawn structure. Okay, but black decides to play e4, which is still fine technically, but it would have been better to try to get the pieces in first, prepare the pieces to attack. Okay, so yeah, white plays here knight to h4, which is a slight mistake, but we'll come back to that. But black plays this move e3.
So just back
which,
sort of mistakes.
Yeah, mistakes, but this is the main deciding blunder of the game, e3.
Yeah.
So the idea of this is that you're trying to open up the king and like give checks, and like you're threatening e takes f2 check and promoting. But you'll notice here that the threat is queen to h5, and then there's no way to stop mate.
Yeah.
So how can black possibly defend against that threat?
Yeah, so the only way to do that would be to play knight g8. You need to just remove this knight. It's the cause of all your trouble. It's looking into all of black's squares, right? And so it would put an end to all these queen h5 issues.
Okay.
And
so if white plays queen h5,
yes.
then you take it, and after all this, then white doesn't have an attack. There's no way to actually cause any problems, even though white's pieces are very well placed. There's no actual point of attack.
Yeah, so this king doesn't look too great.
Yeah, now all white's pawns are getting attacked. But okay, so basically, knight to g8 was one of the only real move to continue the game here, and black would have been better. And what should have white done? So white should have instead played this knight to the center, which gives a tempo by attacking the queen. So there's no knight g8 right now.
Yeah, but now you have to queen to h3, which attacks this pawn
and stops
and covers up that
stops
square.
the threat of queen h5.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the queen would move to d2, let's say, right? Just trying to get out.
Yeah, so white is preparing here, castling queenside and then rook to h1, but that is never really a problem because after
black can just try to trade everything off and get rid of what's, as we talked about before, get rid of that knight.
Knight g8 comes in once
that
again.
Looks a little, yeah.
And after a sample line, for example.
Yeah, so takes let's say you attack this queen, you really want to get on the same file as the king, right? That queen is just defending, and if you try to play queen h6, not only is this queen defending, but also you can just trade everything off.
Yeah, so in this case, black is perfectly fine. And in that continuation, black is just in time. But white is not losing. So in this case, knight g8 would have given black an advantage. But let's see what happens after e3. So after e3, white continues with his original idea, queen to h5, threatening mate. And black's idea is to double check the white king and even promote by taking the rook. But after king to d2, what you'll notice is there's no real good checks. I mean, you could play rook a d8, but after king c2, all of the checking squares are covered. And if we go back to the game, most importantly, these two squares, which would allow black to defend against this checkmate, are covered by the knights. So black cannot defend the checkmate at all.
Yeah, and this would take some careful thought of like calculation, because if your king is about to get double checked like that, you really want to be careful. So in this case, there was literally no way to stop that checkmate. Black understood that, so there was this trade. Right, so even though this promotion happened, rook took.
Black does get some pieces for the queen, but well, black loses the knight, and because white's pieces get in so quickly, it's just game over, and there's not much black can do.
There comes the knight, and right, okay, very like hard fighting attempt.
But, or it might have been. I wonder if it was just a DGT board, like maybe they were analyzing. But yeah, knight to h6 is simply
possibly.
mate. I mean, bishop f4 would have covered this one, but then queen g7's mate. So I guess there's
or
just no way.
Or he just wanted to let him have the mate.
Yeah, there's no way to stop either queen g7 or knight to h6. But yeah, that's how the game ended. A very nice attack by white. It wasn't working for quite a while, but in the end, after the move e3, white was able to ignore all the threats and just escape, and no way to stop checkmate. So that was the key turning point of the game. Thanks for watching.